Subcommittee on Coast Guard and Maritime Transportation come to order. I ask that unanimous consent that the chairman be authorized to declare a recess anytime during the hearing without objection. So that done. I also ask unanimous consent that members not on the subcommittee be present. If they're present, they can participate in the subcommittee. As a reminder, if members have anything to insert document, please email that to documentsti@mail.house.gov. So I now recognize myself for the purpose of opening statement for 5 minutes. We meet here today to examine the Coast Guard's implementation of the recommendations from the Accountability and Transparency Review, as well as the service's efforts to ease its manpower shortages. I'd like to welcome our witnesses joining us today. Vice Admiral Paul Thomas is here, and he's a Deputy Commandant for Mission Support, United States Coast Guard, and Heather McLeod, Director of Homeland Security and Justice at the United States Government Accountability Office. We welcome you both back to subcommittee. Good to see you again. In June of 2023, the Coast Guard briefed the Transportation Committee on Operation Fouled Anchor, the service's years-long investigation into sexual harassment and assault cases and other misconduct at the Coast Guard's Academy that occurred between 1990 and 2006. The investigation uncovered a pattern of not handling cases that would be handled today. As a result, perpetrators were not held properly accountable, and victims were not treated with respect and care they deserved. Unfortunately, the Coast Guard's efforts to inform Congress and the public of these findings were not prompted by transparency, nor did it come up during the last two Congresses while working with the committee to curb sexual assault and sexual harassment. Instead, the committee found out through a news report. That's where I find out most of my information. During the course of that committee's investigation, it was become apparent that some of the service's critical disclosures and document production continues to be driven by leaks and news reports rather than true transparency and accountability. In July of 2023, after the public release of Operation Fouled Anchor report, the Commandant directed a 90-day review of the current laws, policies, practices, and culture designed to prevent and respond to occurrence instances of sexual harassment and harassment within the service. On November 27th, the Coast Guard released the result of the 90-day review, along with more than 30 directed actions by the Commandant, which seek to mitigate instances of harassment, assault, and other misconduct within the service. While the Coast Guard's lack of transparency appears to be driven in part by a desire to protect the service and reputation of the Academy, its failure to be forthcoming achieved the opposite effect. The men and women serving in our Coast Guard, who we asked so much of, deserve better from their leadership. So today, we're going to look back towards the future and discuss the service's efforts to implement practices that will meaningfully address these issues. The Commandant's directed actions, released along with the Accountability and Transparency Report, provides a solid starting place to strengthen protections for victims and uphold the service's values. To ensure these practices are implemented, and to provide the service with the authorities it requires to carry out the recommendations yesterday, Ranking Member Carbajal and I introduced the Coast Guard Accountability and Transparency Act. Vice Admiral Thomas, this legislation will hold the service's feet to the fire to make sure those recommendations are carried out. Coast Guard struggles with transparency and accountability are occurring as it also struggles to retain the recruit service members. Despite increasing emissions demands, the service is operating with a deficit of approximately 4,800 members across its ranks. short nearly 10% of its workforce, the Coast Guard has been forced to reduce staffing standards at the shoreside stations, temporarily close seasonal stations, and decommission cutters ahead of schedule. With fewer people, the Coast Guard cannot continue to operate as it has historically without either reducing its mission or degrading its capabilities. Recognizing these challenges, in the Coast Guard Authorization Act of 2023, the committee authorized for fiscal years 2024 and 2025, $12 million to fund additional recruiting personnel and officers for the Coast Guard Recruiting Command, and $9 million to enhance Coast Guard recruiting capabilities. Look forward to hearing more about the Coast Guard's multi-tiered effort to mitigate its recruiting challenges, including efforts to retain personnel and improve recruiting capabilities. So I now recognize, I'll recognize Ranking Member Carbajal.
Thank you, Chairman Webster, and thank you for calling today's hearing. The issues we're examining today are paramount to the success of the Coast Guard. Over the past 3 years, I've had the opportunity to visit Coast Guard stations across the country. I've been on icebreakers, national security cutters, fast response cutters, various aircraft, and small boats. While I enjoy seeing Coast Guard assets, I leave every visit struck by the professionalism of Coasties. I'm sure that anyone who has a chance to interact with members of the Coast Guard feel the same. Unfortunately, we're here today to talk about the small minority in the Coast Guard whose actions have affected morale, safety, recruitment, retention in the service. As a veteran, I know firsthand the importance of morale in the military. Those choosing to serve our country sacrifice so much, and they deserve to be treated with respect and dignity. Perpetrators of sexual assault and sexual harassment and the command leaders who permit those actions must be held accountable. I look forward to hearing from our witnesses today on how the Coast Guard plans to do that. It is unacceptable that the Coast Guard decided to hide Operation Fouled Anchor. Let me repeat that. Hid Operation Fouled Anchor. This subcommittee conducts oversight of the Coast Guard, and we should have been told. I look forward to hearing today about the systems you put in place to ensure this never happens again, regardless of who's leading the service. More importantly, those involved with burying the findings and recommendations are responsible for 5 years of inaction from the service. I want to be clear. If the former leadership had treated this issue with the seriousness it deserves, the seriousness in which Admiral Fagan is addressing the issue, incidents of sexual assault and sexual harassment would have been greatly prevented. Instead, the former leadership appears to have prioritized the reputation of the Coast Guard over the Coasties. That cannot happen again. I would like to applaud the actions taken by Admiral Fagan since learning of Operation Fouled Anchor. The directed actions in the accountability and the transparency review are comprehensive and serve as a good starting point to effecting cultural change and eradicating this behavior from the service. I am, however, concerned that the Coast Guard is able and willing to make the long-term commitment necessary to effect real change. Leadership at the Coast Guard is constantly changing, so future leaders must continue what Admiral Fagan has started. I look forward to hearing from the GAO today on structural impediments in the Coast Guard. Implementation of reforms must be tracked, measured, and adjusted as necessary. Without the appropriate IT infrastructure, this will be difficult and challenging at best. And that leads me to my last concern, funding. Many of the directed actions in the ATR will require funding. Congress must provide the appropriate funding to ensure a shift in culture within the Coast Guard. Recruitment and retention and the success of every mission depends on it. Mr. Chair, I yield back.
I now recognize the ranking member of the full committee, and Mr. Larson, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chair Webster and Ranking Member Carbajal, for holding this hearing. A decision by former Coast Guard leadership to conceal the existence of Operation Fouled Anchor hurt the Coast Guard, its reputation, and the Coasties serving our country. Former Coast Guard leadership chose not to inform Congress of Operation Fouled Anchor and then hid the findings and recommendations from the public and other Coasties. Had the findings and recommendations from OFA been acted upon in 2018, the Coast Guard could have already implemented meaningful reforms. Instead, these actions sowed distrust among its workforce. So we want to hear today from Deputy Commandant on how the service plans to rebuild trust and ensure its workforce is supported in the future. Culture change can create a more tolerant, accepting, and supportive workforce, and one that is better prepared to complete its mission. With an estimated shortage of roughly 4,800 members, the Coast Guard has both a moral and functional need to implement culture change, so women and men want to join and stay in the service. While culture change is ultimately about changing the behavior of people, getting there is going to require significant resources. For instance, the Coast Guard recently started an integrated primary prevention program to help prevent suicide, sexual assault, harassment, domestic abuse, and child abuse through community engagement, policy programs, and improved practices. However, this Coast Guard program is staffed by one person, while the Department of Defense has over 1,000 staff for a similar program. Ranking Member Carbajal and I sent a letter to the Appropriations Committee last month urging the inclusion of an additional $21.8 million for the Integrated Primary Prevention Program in the final FY24 funding bill. If included, that funding would enable the Coast Guard to immediately begin hiring new civilian employees. In addition, the service needs funding for improvements to human resources, information technology, improvements to governance and oversight at the Academy, enhanced training and professional development for the workforce, and a more robust and sustained support for victims. While the Coast Guard deserves criticism and increased oversight for its handling of sexual assault and sexual harassment, I believe that under the leadership of Admiral Fagan, the service is now on the right path. The Coast Guard, therefore, deserves the support of Congress in addressing this issue. It is facing a budget shortfall that includes a $3 billion shoreside infrastructure backlog and ballooning costs associated with the construction of polar security cutters. Especially when it comes to sexual assault and sexual harassment, we cannot ask the Coast Guard to do more with less. The Coast Guard is a $20 billion service operating on a $13 billion budget, and the women and men who serve in the Coast Guard deserve better. They deserve dorm rooms that are free of asbestos. They deserve access to affordable housing and childcare. They deserve workplaces and technology that assist rather than hinder their mission. And above all, they deserve a work environment free from sexual assault and harassment. So my colleagues will join me in making the case for increased funding for the Coast Guard to address these and other issues. Thank you, and I yield back.
Again, I want to thank and welcome our witnesses and thank them for being here today. Appreciate that. And I'd like to take a moment to explain our lighting system. Greens go, yellows slow up, and red stop. I ask unanimous consent that the witnesses' full testimonies, statements be included in the record without objection. Show that ordered. I ask unanimous consent that the record of today's hearing remain open until time as our witnesses have provided answers to any questions that may be submitted to them in writing without objection. Show that ordered. I ask unanimous consent that the record remain open for 15 days for additional comments and information submitted by the members or the witnesses to include in the record today's hearing. Without objection, show that ordered. As your written testimony has been made part of the record, the committee asks that you limit your time and remarks to 5 minutes. With that, Vice Admiral Thomas, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Good morning, Chairman Webster, Ranking Member Carbajal, and distinguished members of the subcommittee. I truly appreciate this opportunity to testify today on these very important topics. As you know, the Coast Guard helps to enable the nation's economic prosperity, enforces our laws at sea, protects the maritime environment, and performs life-saving missions that are vital to preserving America's maritime interests. To do this, we must employ the very best and brightest our nation has to offer. Implementation of the accountability and transparency review recommendations and other initiatives the Commandant has directed are critically linked to our efforts to recruit and retain those who will perform Coast Guard missions in the 21st century. And as you've mentioned, over the last several months, the service has responded to questions and concerns about the handlings and findings of investigations of prior sexual misconduct at the Coast Guard Academy. But over the course of the last 2 decades, we have taken lessons learned from those investigations to heart, and we have aggressively increased the intensity of our focus on prevention of sexual assault and sexual harassment, not just at the Academy, but across our service. That work continues. We are maturing policies on accountability, listening to and increasing support to survivors and victims, taking concrete actions towards strengthening the service culture and commitment to our core values of honor, respect, and devotion to duty. From our senior leaders to our most junior recruits, everyone in our service must be committed to focusing or fostering a culture where each member is valued, empowered, trusted, and supported. Following the completion of the 90-day accountability and transparency review, the Commandant directed over 30 actions intended to improve transparency, accountability, awareness, prevention, climate and culture, and victim support. And we are taking action now without delay. And while we have completed several of the Commandant's directed actions, we have made a long-term commitment to strengthening our culture. Ongoing initiatives include working with Congress to identify and address gaps in Coast Guard authorities related to accountability, building an integrated prevention program, and creating a new enterprise victim advocate position, which is the first of its kind amongst the armed services. We believe these measures will be a strong step towards strengthening our service culture and ensuring a work environment that is free of sexual assault, harassment, bullying, hazing, retaliation, and reprisal for all Coast Guard members, always. But we recognize this cannot be only a surge effort around the Commandant's directed action. It cannot be one and done. We are committed to continuous improvement as an essential part of our culture. Let me assure you, we will sustain this effort. This work will help us better align our actions with our values and better define who we are and what we stand for. And that work is necessary to attract, recruit, and retain today's talent. Like many employers in all of our military services, we face fierce competition for talent. The Coast Guard is currently 10% below authorized strength within our enlisted workforce, and we anticipate that shortage may grow in 2024. Our workforce shortage has had an impact on our operations and our personnel. In response, we are taking decisive action to reduce operational risk and mitigate the burden shouldered by our frontline workforce. This summer, we are aligning the workforce to prioritize life-saving missions, national security, protection of the marine transportation system. And going forward, we will continue to evaluate force strength, mission demands, and staffing priorities. And while we are currently cautiously optimistic about our FY24 recruiting efforts, we must continue ongoing efforts to increase awareness of the Coast Guard's value to the nation, the benefits of military service, and we must identify more candidates for recruitment. To this end, and with your help, we are increasing resources aimed at building recruiting capacity and performance, generating more leads, and improving overall recruiting processes. We are also focused on reducing barriers to entry to our service. And while recruiting is critically important, retaining our workforce is equally so, and it requires similar focus. We have recently seen our attrition numbers increase, which contributes to our workforce gaps. The Coast Guard has taken action to ensure our workforce policies, processes, and infrastructure provides better flexibility, transparency, predictability, and support to our members and their families. We simply must make it easier to serve for a full career. I thank you for this opportunity to highlight workforce challenges and the strong linkage between strengthening service culture and building a workforce for the future. I look forward to your questions.
Ms. McLeod, you're recognized for 5 minutes for your testimony.
Chairman Webster, Ranking Member Carbajal, members of the subcommittee, thank you for the opportunity to be here today. My testimony is based on our preliminary observations of the Coast Guard's recent efforts to implement actions associated with the Accountability and Transparency Review. The issue of sexual assault and harassment in the Coast Guard is not new. Over the last 2 decades, Congress has taken steps to address these issues. For example, Congress has established numerous requirements to help DoD and the Coast Guard efforts for preventing and responding to incidents of sexual assault in the military. Congress passed a total of 249 statutory requirements directing DoD and the Coast Guard to address prevention and response to sexual assault incidents. More than 30 of these requirements applied to the Coast Guard. For years, GAO has also made recommendations to military services to improve their sexual assault and harassment prevention and response efforts. Since 2014, we've made over 80 recommendations in this area. Most of these recommendations were specific to DoD, but they provide insights across military services. We plan to initiate a review specific to Coast Guard sexual assault prevention and response later this year. The Coast Guard has taken some steps to address these issues. For example, between 2002 and 2023, the Coast Guard established 19 policies and initiatives, 10 trainings, 6 victim services efforts intended to prevent, respond to, and support victims of sexual assault and harassment. Despite these actions, the problems persist. In an internal investigation called Operation Fouled Anchor, the Coast Guard examined 102 separate allegations of sexual assault from 1990 to 2006 at the Coast Guard Academy. The investigation concluded that the Academy often mishandled these cases. After media reporting on Operation Fouled Anchor in June 2023, the Commandant directed a 90-day review of policy processes, practices, and service culture relevant to countering sexual assault and harassment in the Coast Guard. The resulting report identified areas for improvement across the service to ensure a culture of accountability and transparency. In November 2023, the Commandant directed the Coast Guard to implement 33 initial actions to address the findings of the review and help ensure service members have an experience free from sexual assault and harassment. As of February 2024, the Coast Guard has completed 5 actions. For example, officials told us that in December, the Coast Guard administered a survey across the service on unit climate, harassment and discrimination, diversity and inclusion, and other aspects of organizational climate. Swift implementation of defined actions is important, but it must be balanced with effective controls for ensuring the anticipated improvements to the culture of accountability and transparency is achieved. Even though it has already implemented certain actions, the service has not developed a plan to evaluate its efforts. As a result, GAO is making a recommendation to the Coast Guard to develop a plan to evaluate the actions that the service is taking to improve its culture of accountability and transparency. This will help ensure that the actions taken are achieving the intended outcomes. We acknowledge that measuring the effectiveness of actions taken to improve Coast Guard culture may be difficult, but the Coast Guard already has resources, including regular employee surveys and contacts with experts in DoD that could prove useful in this effort. The information would help the Coast Guard management understand the impact of these actions on service members. Taking these steps will help ensure the service is improving its culture, which could assist in the recruitment and retention of its workforce. Given the challenges the Coast Guard faces with fully staffing its workforce, it is incumbent upon the service to not only establish actions, but to ensure they are effective. Chairman Webster, Ranking Member Carbajal, and members of the subcommittee, this completes my prepared statement. I'd be pleased to respond to any questions you may have.
Thank you so much for your presentation, both of you. And so it's time for questions. I recognize myself for 5 minutes to start off the questions. And Vice Admiral Thomas, I'll begin with you. First of all, have you ever considered, or are you considering being like the rest of the military's service schools in that they require a congressional appointment in order to get into to be admitted into the academy?
Thank you for the question, Congressman. That is a topic that comes up periodically. We've looked at it. The fact of the matter is that our class size is so small that we couldn't have a nominee from every congressman and senator. But also what we found is the most diverse academy in our nation is the one that doesn't have congressional appointments. That's the Coast Guard Academy. And so the issue's been studied several times, and we feel like we've got the right mix right now.
So I introduced, along with Ranking Member Carbajal and Chairman Graves, Ranking Member of the full committee, Mr. Larson, a bill called the Coast Guard Accountability and Transparency Act. I don't know if you're familiar with that yet, but having their support and so the support of all, I guess they call it the Big Four, it would be part just to how to implement the Commandant's directed actions and require metrics to track that effectiveness. As has been said before, to date, there have been 5 of the 33 actions have been completed. What's the timeline to complete the rest of these actions, and how will you measure the effectiveness of those actions?
Thank you, Congressman. I am familiar with the bill. We appreciate the committee's work on that bill and the opportunity to help contribute to it. There are 33 directed actions are really just the beginning. 5 of those are complete. About 9 will be complete in a matter of weeks. 14 are going to take about 6 months to a year, and then the remaining 5 require a lot of investment, so they'll take longer. The bill that you mentioned requires us to report back to this committee on the progress of on the directed actions. We welcome that and look forward to it. The bill does a number of other things that we've asked for as well, and so we appreciate that, particularly with regard to transfer of cadet who are victims and professionalization of our prosecutors.
So, Vice Admiral, the infrastructure at Cape May and the Academy is literally crumbling. And what impact, if any, does the dated barracks facilities at the Academy, on which the Coast Guard's ability to attract applicants, does it make it harder to attract applicants?
I'm sorry, sir, I couldn't hear you.
I'm sorry. The infrastructure at the Academy, does it, because it's dilapidated in some cases, does that hinder your attraction of new?
Yeah. I mean, absolutely. We need to modernize both our Coast Guard Academy and our boot camp. We want to continue to attract the best and brightest, and when people come to visit the Academy, particularly compared to West Point and Annapolis, our facilities don't match up. So we definitely need to invest there.
Ms. McLeod, why is it important to develop a performance plan to assess the Coast Guard's actions in response to Operation Fouled Anchor? And what are some of the ways the Coast Guard can effectively measure that effectiveness of the Commandant's directed actions?
Yeah, I mean, it's really important to have the actions, and that's a great first step for the Coast Guard, but to ensure that these actions are having the intended impact is also an equally important step. And I think that, through our discussions with the Coast Guard, there are resources such as employee surveys, their communication with experts over at DoD. There are ways to measure the impact of these actions. Employee surveys is just one example of a tool that could be used to do this.
Thank you very much. My time has expired. So, Mr. Carbajal, recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Admiral Thomas, since the period covered under OFA, the Coast Guard has changed laws, policies, and procedures to better protect its membership. I also believe that the directed actions in the ATR put the service on the right path moving forward. Where the Coast Guard continues to struggle, though, is trust. What are you doing to regain the trust of service members and prospective service members?
Thank you, Congressman, and thank you for all the visits that you make to Coast Guard units around the service. We are focused on restoring trust. We have lost trust with this committee, we've lost trust with the American public and with our workforce. You know, the effort that we have, and will be a sustained effort, is different than what we've done in the past in 3 important ways. The first one is that we are focused on more than just sexual assault and sexual harassment, because most coasties, as you mentioned, don't engage in those activities, and so if you focus on that, they check out. But we have to focus on our core value of respect, and respect across the full spectrum of behavior. So we're focusing on behaviors to the left of sexual assault. The second way that it's different is we can't do this from top down like we've tried before. Our culture needs to be owned by our most junior people, and we will get after it through the mess deck. And then the third way, which you've mentioned as well, is we need to invest. And we are working with this committee, we will invest in the workforce that will help us not only get after the full spectrum of harmful behaviors, but restore trust with our workforce.
Thank you. Not to be redundant, but building on that, Admiral Thomas, the Coast Guard is under immense pressure across all missions. Culture change in any organization can take a very long time, and it's oftentimes very difficult. While Admiral Fagan has made sexual assault, sexual harassment, and the culture change a priority, what systems are in place or have been put in place to ensure that the effort continues beyond her leadership for the institution?
Yes, sir. So as I said, the question that we are asking ourselves in senior leadership is, how do we make this time different? And the way we're going to do that is focusing on behaviors that we know are harmful on the spectrum that lead to sexual assault and that we call gateway behaviors. We're going to do that. We're going to build a workforce with investment and the help of this committee that focuses on those things. And then we're going to make sure that we initiate this effort, not top down, but bottom up, and that's how we will sustain it.
Thank you. I was hoping for more specifics, so I'll let you submit more information to me later on about those specifics, because it's about those specific systems changes and systems procedures that I think at the end of the day will yield the result that we're hoping to achieve. Heather, Ms. McLeod, the ATR includes a comprehensive list of directed actions. How important is tracking implementation, and how could the Coast Guard measure culture change other than surveys?
It is critical to track the actions. Without that, it's just basically a checklist, right? They can measure this not only through surveys, as I previously mentioned, but by analyzing the data that they already collect. In our previous studies, we found that Coast Guard collects a range of data points and information that could be really helpful to understanding how widespread these actions are and the effect of the potential new actions.
Thank you. I never thought my graduate studies would help me as much as it has when it comes to organizational culture change, which was the subject of my studies. But that couldn't be more front and center as it relates to this specific issue and this specific subject. So I appreciate your testimony, and I do want to encourage real, tangible actions that can be quantifiable, that can get us the result that I think we're all seeking for. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Mr. Babin, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Sir, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank our witnesses as well, Vice Admiral Thomas and Ms. McLeod. Thank you for being here. Admiral Thomas, my questions today will be for you. Operation Fouled Anchor made it very clear that the Coast Guard needs to be doing much more to protect its own folks after 102 allegations of sexual harassment, including, I think, rape, was in there as well. Recently, I was informed that the Coast Guard Academy has approved a biological male's requested transition to being a transgender female student. This individual believes that they are a woman, And the Coast Guard has decided that this young man should be able to use the ladies' berthing, bathroom, and shower facilities. Admiral Thomas, do you believe in the wake of a scandal involving dozens of serious reports of sexual misconduct and a widespread failure to protect young female cadets at the Coast Guard Academy, that allowing a young man with male anatomy into the female facilities at the Academy reflects positively on the Coast Guard's efforts to protect their young cadets?
Congressman, thanks for the question. I'm not aware of any linkage in literature or research between transgender members and sexual assault or harassment. I will say that the Coast Guard follows the exact same policies of the Department of Defense with regard to transgender members, and that policy that applies at the Academy applies across our service. And that is simply that if a member has a medical diagnosis of gender dysphoria with medically necessary gender transition,
I hear you.
support them
I
through
hear you.
that.
But I'll tell you, right over here in Virginia, and that's just one episode, in a public school, we had a rape by a transgender of a young female going into the facilities. That student was sent to another school where he raped another female student. It happens. And I hope that you don't close your eyes or your ears, and I hope the policies will change at the Coast Guard. It should be a DOD-wide policy to not have this kind of stuff going on in the military at all. But we're here talking about Coast Guard. Recruitment is a major problem across the whole military, but also specifically today in the Coast Guard. People pay attention. The Coast Guard's policies will drive or push away potential recruits. It's a mystery to me how we can think that recruitment is, if we continue these woke policies, that recruitment is going to improve. It won't. I'd encourage you to think very hard about how your policies might impact prospective recruits. Do you really think allowing men into the ladies' restrooms at the Academy will inspire more female recruits, or quite frankly, allowing any transgender policies? Is this going to improve recruitment, in your opinion?
I don't think anything that limits the pool of potential candidates will help us in our recruiting. And we have a number of transgender members in the Coast Guard who are exceptional performers and contribute to our service and to our nation every single day.
Between the House legislation to improve transparency and the Coast Guard's own new policies to prevent another Operation Fouled Anchor, I'm hopeful that the Coast Guard will make serious strides and changes in the future. I would ask you to take a few moments as we close to tell the committee and the people watching at home how and what strides and changes that you're making. And it sounds from your conversation today like you have no intentions of changing this. But I would like to hear it if that is the case, though, how it will impact recruitment numbers going forward. That's what we're here for today to discuss.
Yes, sir. I think the national dialogue about service in the military is potentially harming all the services with regard to the recruiting efforts.
What's the national dialogue?
Well, I mean, there's a dialogue around joining the military and getting harmed. There's a dialogue around joining the military and being woke, and those are not helpful to us.
If you can join the military and there's 102 allegations of sexual harassment at the Coast Guard Academy, and you're going to have a male using female facilities, I would think that's not going to improve your recruitment.
Well, I absolutely agree with you, sir. That's why we're so laser focused on eradicating sexual assault and sexual harassment from our service and providing the best support we possibly can when there are victims.
Without changes, I don't think recruitment is going to improve. I'll yield back.
Mr. Larson, you recognize for 5
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I think it should be clear there is not a relationship. There is not a relationship between gender dysphoria, transgender people, and sexual assault and sexual harassment. There's no evidence at the Coast Guard of that. There's no evidence in the DOD of that. There's just no evidence that that is the case. We have a serious recruitment problem in the Coast Guard for a variety of reasons. Transgendered individuals who I think there's possibly a total of 5 throughout the entire Coast Guard, is not the issue. with regards to recruitment at the Coast Guard. There are a lot of issues. One of them we're here to talk about today. And I would encourage all committee members to go to the academy and to meet with the student groups that represent the broad diversity at the academy, to hear their views on this issue and many other issues, and to understand that the academy is recruiting the finest individuals that we have here in the United States to serve in the U.S. Coast Guard. I would also want to be sure that we be careful about attacking the 10,000 other transgender individuals who serve in the active duty component and selected reserve in the U.S. military as well, and tying sexual harassment and sexual assault to them without any evidence at all. They're serving proudly. We need to support them. But Admiral Thomas, we're here to talk about Operation Fouled Anchor and what the Coast Guard is doing to address that. Can the plan, this very ambitious plan that Commandant has put forward in the Accountability and Transparency Review, can that plan be implemented with the current funding and workforce levels?
No, sir. Without investing differently, we will get the same results. And we have been focused for the last 2 decades on responding to, investigating sexual assaults, and supporting victims. We need to continue to do that. We also need to focus on those precursor behaviors that we know can eventually lead to sexual harassment and sexual assault. That requires investment in integrated primary prevention. As you mentioned, the other services have invested. The National Guard alone has over 800 people involved in that. So no, without investment, we will not get a different result.
Do you have an estimate of the number of, minimum number of folks the U.S. Coast Guard would need to implement this type of program?
We think, preliminarily, we think it's between 50 and 80 across our service.
Say it again.
We think it's about between 50 and 80 people across our service.
50 and 80, sure. What role are what role are you asking the cadets at the academy to play in addressing this problem?
Great question, sir. So, not just the cadets at the academy, but across our service, we need everyone in the service to own our culture, and particularly to own our culture of respect. The Coast Guard Academy, as you mentioned, is the one place in the service where that is strongest. And we have groups of cadets against sexual assault. They hold each other accountable. And that's the activity that we need to see across our service. When a second-class petty officer on the mess deck of a ship holds his peer accountable for inappropriate behavior, we are making progress. I don't know how to measure that, but I'll know it when I see it.
Well, I'd encourage you as well to help those cadets hold the Academy and the Coast Guard leadership accountable as well. Not just taking direction, but using those skills to hold leadership accountable as well.
Yes, sir, and if you saw Cadet Holstrom testify in front of the Senate, you saw that in action.
Ms. McLeod, the status of the 81 recommendations, it wasn't quite clear to me. Are all those recommendations for U.S. Coast Guard and DOD, or were there DOD recommendations and U.S. Coast Guard recommendations?
Yeah, that's a terrific question. So a lot of our work to this point at GAO on sexual assault and harassment in the military has focused on the DOD services. So that is the cumulative number of recommendations. We currently have 4 to the Coast Guard. The remaining are DOD, and they're actively, both DOD and the Coast Guard are actively working to close those recommendations.
Now, I know you're trying to come up with measurements. Does this response from the current Coast Guard leadership feel different as you evaluate the response to Operation Fouled Anchor? Or does GAO get into the feeling business, or you just like strictly numbers?
Yeah, and I think we have future work lined up in this area that will really tell us. I mean, I think that in other areas that we've examined in the Coast Guard, we've seen a lot of actions to be implemented, and then when we take a closer look at how they're following through and noticing whether, evaluating whether those actions are having an impact or are even fully implemented in a timely way is where we've had recommendations in other areas to the Coast Guard.
Thank you. I yield back. Thank you.
Mr. Ezell, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Vice Admiral Thomas and Ms. McLeod, thank you for your testimony today on the Coast Guard's recruitment challenges. We cannot allow the manpower shortage to continue affecting the service's ability to carry out its critical missions. Vice Admiral Thomas, we're all too familiar with the challenges caused by this shortage and how it's causing the Coast Guard to wrestle with tough decisions regarding personnel reassignments and station closures. Could you guide us through that difficult process and how you go about prioritizing these decisions?
Thank you for the question. I mean, we recently conducted what we called a Force Alignment Initiative, and that was so that we could maintain readiness across our service. We looked at areas, particularly with regard to our small boat stations, where there's redundant cover in our search and rescue system, and we collapsed some crews so we could fully man one station and not reduce our coverage or our response time for search and rescue. So that's how we did it. We looked around the nation, where can we do that and not increase risk to the public?
Thank you. As personnel are reassigned and stations are closed, I want to ensure that our nation's coast, such as the Gulf Coast, are fully protected. I recently became aware of an incident where a vessel capsized 31 miles off the Mississippi Gulf Coast. Thankfully, the Coast Guard, alongside with the Civil Air Patrol, responded quickly and managed to rescue the stranded individuals. The incident shows the Coast Guard's ability to adapt and use partnerships to help us, cover these shortfalls. Can you share any other examples with us where you've had some partner sharing and accomplished your mission?
Sure. What the Coast Guard, the expertise the Coast Guard brings to the search and rescue system, particularly in inland waters, is the ability to coordinate searches across all available assets. So just recently, we had a vessel missing off of the coastline of Corpus Christi. We were able to employ a CBP unmanned aerial system, and they were able to locate that vessel for us, and we could get a boat out to help them quickly. We do that all the time. That's how we do search and rescue.
Very good. Yeah, when I was a sheriff in my former life, we spent a great deal of time working with the Coast Guard, so I really appreciate that. Unmanned vessels are being used more in both civil and defense industries. A lot of this innovation is happening in my district. How can these and similar technologies help address some of the Coast Guard's manpower issues?
So we currently employ unmanned systems off of our cutters. They're smaller UAS. We definitely need to get into larger UAS for persistent surveillance and search capability. And I don't know that it helps our manning issue. If you look at the other services, they have large crews to fly just one unmanned system, but it certainly will help us in terms of mission effectiveness.
I'd like to invite you down to see some of the shipyards that are building these things in my district. I think you'd really enjoy that. Vice Admiral, I want to ensure the Coast Guard keeps its recruitment standards high and continues to accept only the most qualified candidates. What steps are you taking to widen the pool of potential recruits without lowering standards?
So we have increased the population from which we can recruit by changing some of the entry barriers. Okay. But we have not decreased the standard from which you complete boot camp or you complete A school or you complete the academy. So we open the doors wider to come in, but it's still the same standard to get out.
Very good. Thank you both for your time today. And Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Let's see, Mr. Auchincloss, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman. Vice Admiral, I appreciate the testimony. You noted in your testimony that the current 10% workforce shortage is one of the most significant in the Coast Guard's history, and it's likely to get worse in 2024. And as a result of this shortage, personnel at Station Boston and Station Cape Cod Canal have been prioritized elsewhere, and the seasonal station in Scituate has been transitioned to a forward operating location. How is the Coast Guard reprioritizing missions to account for the current staffing shortfall? I know you, in some of the notes I have from correspondence ahead of this hearing, talked about collapsing redundant search and rescue missions. is there now a degradation in operational readiness on the coast of Massachusetts?
So Massachusetts coast, and I'm from Massachusetts, so I watch that state carefully. But the coast of Massachusetts is about 192 miles long and it has over a dozen Coast Guard stations. So it is one of the areas of our search and rescue station or system that has the greatest redundancy. In the case of Situate, we're still covering that from the parent station in Boston and Cape Cod. We have the same response capability that we had before from other stations.
So help me understand then, you have a workforce shortage, you say that's a problem, you make changes, but then you tell me that the changes are not affecting operational readiness. So why, connect those dots for me. Why is the workforce shortage a problem then?
So in a place like Massachusetts in particular, our stations are still located where they were when we used to row to save people. And so now we have much more capable assets that are faster and have longer ranges. So we have overlap coverage. So whereas before, 3 different stations could respond in the same amount of time to a search and rescue case, now it's down to 1 because we've collapsed those crews.
So scarcity was the handmaiden of efficiency for you.
In some cases,
But Vice Admiral, you're not doing a great job then of pitching us on a bigger budget.
you asked the logic by which we made the decisions on where we should shift our forces, and we looked at where we can maintain our response standards and still shift those forces.
So always happy to see efficiencies in the provision of services and that we can get the same for less. So now let's have the second conversation. What do you need the money? What do you need the personnel and the money for then? Where is the shortfall being manifested in operational degradation?
We have shortfalls across our fleet, particularly with regard to depot level maintenance on our aircraft and our cutters. We have shortfalls with regard to no accounting for inflation in our budgets. We have about 40% inflation, for example, just on aviation parts. So there are definitely
All right, but
budget
in plain speak here, you're saying that the shortfall is being seen as we're not maintaining our assets as well as we should. Is that what you're saying?
We are struggling to maintain our assets to our standards.
So we're kind of taking on technical debt, as it were. We're going to be paying more in the future because we're maintaining our assets more poorly right now because of the workforce shortage?
No, sir, not because of the workforce shortage. You asked me where I thought you asked me where are our budget shortfalls. Workforce shortage will also impact our ability to maintain our assets. We're mitigating that, but eventually, of course, that will become an issue as well.
Okay, so lack of money is hurting the maintenance of assets we have. Lack of workforce is hurting what?
Lack of workforce is hurting our ability to conduct the missions at the same places and levels that we have in the past.
But Vice Admiral, you just told me that we're doing the mission fine, and at least in my home state, because of efficiencies from an outdated operating model. So what states are we not doing as good of a job as we should be because of the workforce shortage?
One of the things that the Coast Guard does often, many times a year, is surge to different operations. So we are losing our surge force. If we had to respond to a hurricane or oil spill or a crisis on the southwest border like we have in the past, then you would see some real problems with regard to our ability to maintain our regular missions.
Okay, so baseline operational readiness is kind of okay, but if there was these outlier events, maybe we don't have the same bandwidth to respond to them. In the last 20 seconds, Ms. McLeod, do you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, I think we've talked about this before on a prior hearing, but the Coast Guard has a process to evaluate its workforce needs,
They haven't
which
done
is
it.
well behind in that. Yes.
Thank you.
Gentleman yields back. Chair now recognizes Ms. Skolton for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I really want to thank the witnesses for being here today. This is a critical hearing. I proudly represent Coast Guard City, USA. We take the safety and security of our Coast Guard members very seriously. Everyone deserves to feel safe in their workspace, especially those who put their lives on the line to keep us safe. They also deserve to be taken seriously when they come forward. and their courage must be met with actions towards bringing perpetrators to justice. The cover-up and lack of transparency that Operation Fouled Anchor revealed is putting a dark, dark cloud over the Coast Guard that no one deserves. It's unacceptable. My first question, in response to Operation Fouled Anchor, the Coast Guard Commandant Linda Fagan, of course, as we had discussed, chartered a 90-day accountability and transparency review in July of 2023, outlining the Coast Guard's actions moving forward to prevent these actions from happening again. Vice Admiral Thomas, we've got a 95-page report here. We've got 5 different recommendations that we had talked about. But I would like to hear from you in plain language, how can people feel safe in the Coast Guard today?
Well, Congresswoman, first, thank you. I know your passion for our people, and I really do appreciate that. And I also want to acknowledge, your statement about the Coast Guard failing victims in this case. There's no question about that. And it goes beyond a failure to disclose Operation Fouled Anchor. It was the original mishandling in those cases. So we have been focused intensely on doing that better over the last 2 decades, and we have a list of resources that we've put after that. As I mentioned, we have to restore trust with our workforce, and we are working to do that through our culture, in particular our culture of respect. One of the indicators that I look at is what is the time between when an assault occurs and when a report is made, and there are a lot of things that affect that, but overall that number's going down, which indicates to me that trust in the system, trust that we will investigate, we will support, is going up, but we need to continue to work on that.
I couldn't agree with you more that culture change has to be at the top of the list. I think one of the ways we change that culture is by honoring victims when they come forward and getting justice for them. How is the Coast Guard working to make that happen, and how have we gotten justice for these victims?
Yeah, so a lot of things have changed since the Fouled Anchor days with regard to our ability to hold people accountable. The laws have changed. The definition of rape has changed. The statute of limitations has changed. We are just now changing our policies so that we can change the characterization of service for members who have been substantiated to have sexually harassed or assaulted a person, so they cannot leave the service with a discharge higher than general. And we are working to implement all of the authority that we have for highest grade held boards, which allow us to go back and retire someone at a lower grade because they've been substantiated for sexual assault and sexual harassment. So we are strengthening our ability to hold people accountable. More important, though, I think, is we're being more transparent about how we hold the people accountable. And we're talking to our workforce, not in ways that violates due process or privacy rights, but in ways that people can see the consequences for these activities and then understand that we do hold people accountable.
Operation Fouled Anchor covered a period from 1990 to 2006. Almost 20 years has passed in that time. What are we doing now to keep track of incidents of sexual harassment and assault that are happening, and how can the American people know that these we are actually having measurable impact in lowering these instances, and that the actions that you're taking are actually being implemented?
So, I mean, we track sexual assaults and we report them to Congress, and you can see trends. And I'm never really sure what to make of the numbers with regard to number of reports, because in a given year you might get reports from 5 years ago, 10 years ago. I think the real key is, we do hold people accountable, and when we do, we let the service know what happened, not names, and how we held them accountable.
Thank you. My time is expiring, so I'll yield back. Thank you.
Gentlelady years back. Mr. Vandreau, you're recognized 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. The United States Coast Guard is currently operating at approximately a 4,800 member deficit, and it's across its workforce. Most of them are active duty personnel, to the best of my knowledge. Why do you think this is the case? It isn't for the lack of opportunity in the Coast Guard. The Coast Guard provides members with a lot of opportunity, and there are more resources available seemingly by the day.
It's not because of the lack of opportunity for growth, because the Coast Guard affords all worthy men and women the skills to succeed in both the service and in civilian life. I believe, in my opinion, it's through this administration's woke military agenda, which prioritizes DEI initiatives instead of continuing the tradition of seeking of the best of the best. Let me be clear. Our military should be the smartest, the best, the sharpest, the toughest, the most focused. We're dealing with a great number of bad actors out there. And it's not just happening in the Coast Guard, it's happening in each and every one of the branches of the United States military. I speak with people who are Marines that are leaving early, people in the Army, the Navy, and the Coast Guard. They've had it. They didn't get into these services for those reasons. And there's been attempts to alleviate the issue of the shortages by expanding the eligible candidates to include individuals, and I want to verify this, who may not typically qualify for service due to physical fitness, criminal history, and possible drug use. What's going on? Where are the goals? And I don't blame you all. You get directives from above. I'm glad you're here, and I appreciate you. And I always appreciate the Coast Guard. But where are the golden standards of which the United States military and the Coast Guard has always operated? Vice Admiral Thomas, is there any concern, and I know this is a hard question, I get it, but is there any concern that the inclusion of previously ineligible candidates will degrade the capabilities of the Coast Guard operations? They were ineligible for a reason. You can answer that.
So we have expanded the pool of eligible people to recruit into our service, as have all the services. We have not seen a degradation in readiness or performance because we haven't changed the exit criteria from places like boot camp. A lot of the criteria that made someone ineligible previously really doesn't impact their ability to serve in the military. Things like where do they have tattoos, things like certain medical conditions that we previously ruled them out. Now we allow them in.
Vice Admiral, are they as physically fit when they leave Cape May? It's in my district. And
Absolutely.
I'm very familiar with. They are every bit as physically fit, and I hope the answer is yes, as those individuals 5, 10, 15 years ago.
Absolutely, same standards. One of the things that we will kick off in May at Cape May is a pre-recruit training session so we can take recruits who don't meet our forming standards and give them a chance to get in shape and get their test scores up, and then we move them into boot camp. The other services are doing that as well. It just expands opportunity for Americans.
So do you have to do some remedial training? I know that's even true. I speak to people. We had a hearing with county colleges throughout the country, and they say one of the things they have to do is people are coming out of high school and they don't have the skills that they should, so they've got to go back and do remedial training because we're falling so short. Is that true here? You have to train them, bring them up to snuff?
Yes, sir.
You can say undoubtedly, though, and I'm not questioning you, I just want to make sure I'm clear, that these men and women are every bit as good when they graduate as they were before.
Congressman, I'm going to be at a boot camp graduation this spring. I invite you to show up there with me.
Oh, I've been there for them.
And you'll
very
see,
proud to be there.
You'll see the men and women that we graduate in are top notch.
If I'm available, let me know as far as you can in advance. If I'm available, I'll be there, and I've been there in the past before I was a congressman. I was there when I was a county commissioner. I was there when I was a mayor. I was there when I was a state assemblyman. I was there when I was a state senator. I'm really proud of you guys. I want you to understand that. When I say guys, I mean men and women. I'm proud of you. I just want to make sure we keep that we are the best. Due to the shortages, there's going to be a temporary transition of personnel from Western River units, leaving 1,500 positions temporarily vacant. Vice Admiral, how will these vacancies affect the Coast Guard's mission in these areas and elsewhere?
Sorry, sir, are you talking about the Western Rivers?
Yes, I'm sorry. I said it quickly because I'm running out of time.
Oh, yeah. So, we temporarily suspended some small boat operations in Western Rivers. We are not the primary search and rescue provider there in any case. It's always great to be able to operate our boats there, but that was one of the lowest risk areas, and so that's where we adjusted our forces.
Okay. I thank you for your answers, Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you, and No further questions to come from any member of the committee? Don't see anybody to recognize. Don't anybody here?
Do we have to do another round, or could I go ahead?
No.
Could I go ahead and can I speak one more time?
So seeing none there, this concludes the hearing today. I would like to thank each of the witnesses for coming and appearing and their testimony. Okay, Mr. Carbajal would like to talk, so we're going to, I'll hold my last.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm sorry I didn't make myself as clear as I could have. You know, I just wanted to address one of our colleagues previously touched on the transgender issue. And as a veteran myself, I wanted to just address that briefly. You know, once upon a time in our country, we were concerned that we heard a lot of the same arguments about African Americans. We heard those arguments about Latinos. We heard those arguments about women. And most recently, the arguments about gay men and women. And the latest now is transgender. And I think the evidence bears out that there is no negative impact in our recruitment and readiness with individuals that are transgender serving in our military. As a matter of fact, a comprehensive study was done by DOD and the RAND Corporation in 2015 that said of the other 18 countries that allowed transgender personnel to openly serve, in no one case was there any evidence of an effect on operational effectiveness, readiness, and cohesion of force. And I share that because I think when you consider all the services have a recruitment challenge, we need to be doing everything possible, not only to support our men and women that are serving now, but to make sure that we are inviting all of those Americans that want to serve and can serve able and can perform as any other service member. And so I only make my comments to remind us that it is, I think, wrong, again, to single out transgender individuals as being a drag on our services. I think they have been serving, they perform ably, and they're as American as everyone else. And I think a lot of the arguments being made are not on point. I know an example was given of somebody who committed a certain crime, but no one incident characterizes a whole class of people. We have bad actors with every group, with every race, and it's important to keep that in mind. So, Mr. Chairman, I appreciate you letting me make those comments. It was more than a question, but I appreciate the opportunity to provide the counter argument on that point and that issue. Thank you
Mr.
so
Chairman, may I respond to that?
Sure.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'll be brief. Nobody would ever say that somebody shouldn't be admitted because they're male, female, transgender, gay, straight. It's not what I'm speaking about. I'm speaking about standards. And I will tell you, because of some of the changes that have occurred in the military, and I have to admit, I didn't serve in the military, but I served in the VA. And I saw the men and women who sacrificed with broken hearts, broken minds, broken spirits, broken souls from branches of the military. And I know a lot of individuals that have a lot of support in the military in New Jersey with the people I work with. And they are the ones that tell me this. So I don't need you to answer. I don't mean to put you on the spot, but it is a concern. And all I merely say is we want the fastest, best, smartest, most focused, and toughest military on the face of the globe, because if we do not have that, we will fail. And that includes the Coast Guard. Mr. Chairman, I thank you for your lenience. I yield back.
Okay, I'd like to, again, thank the witnesses for coming. We appreciated your testimony, and the committee stands adjourned.